Everyone's heard the word kamikaze, but almost no one actually understands what it meant before the suicide missions, before the final desperate years of the Pacific War, before the images of planes plunging into aircraft carriers became the defining symbol of Japanese sacrifice. There was something quieter happening. Something that gets overlooked in almost every documentary, every history book, every retelling of the air war in the Pacific. Japanese fighter pilots, the best trained aviators in the world at the outbreak of the war, were flying into combat without parachutes. Not because they forgot them, not because command forgot to issue them, not because the planes couldn't carry them. They were choosing to leave them behind. And understanding why they made that choice tells you more about the Pacific War than almost anything else. It tells you about a culture that had been militarized from the inside out. It tells you about a system that had been engineering human beings into weapons for decades. It tells you about pride, about death, about honor, and about the terrifying gap between what Japan's air commanders believed their pilots were and what they actually needed them to be. If you want to understand this war, not the maps and the dates and the carrier tonnage, but the actual human machinery that drove it, then stay with this. Because what you're about to hear is not the version they put in school textbooks. And if you find yourself thinking about this stuff the way we do, subscribe, because we go deep on stories exactly like this one every single time. Let's start at the beginning. Because to understand why Japanese pilots didn't wear parachutes, you first have to understand who Japanese pilots were, or more precisely, who they were trained to be. In the 1930s, the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army Air Forces were not simply military institutions. They were belief systems. They were extensions of a national ideology that had been building for decades, rooted in the concept of Bushido, the way of the warrior, fused with a modern industrial militarism that had turned the entire Japanese state into a war machine by the time the 1930s rolled around. The Samurai Code, the real version, not the romanticized movie version, held that a warrior who surrendered, who allowed himself to be captured, who failed to die in battle, had committed the ultimate dishonor, not just to himself, but to his family, to his ancestors, and to his emperor. Now take that belief system and pour it into the cockpit of a Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter. That's what Japan did. The men selected for pilot training in the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service were among the most rigorously screened candidates in the history of military aviation. Not just physically, mentally, emotionally, ideologically. From the moment they entered training, these men were subjected to a process designed less to teach them how to fly and more to rebuild them from the ground up as instruments of the emperor's will. Physical punishment was routine. Sleep deprivation was a tool. The training pipeline was brutal, in ways that went far beyond aerobatics and gunnery. Instructors routinely beat students, not out of sadism, but out of deliberate institutional doctrine. The goal was to strip away any attachment to personal survival, to make the pilot psychologically incapable of putting his own life above the mission. By the time a Japanese naval aviator finished his training, he was an extraordinarily capable pilot. But he was also something else. He was a man who had been systematically taught that his death was not a tragedy, but a destiny. And into this context, the parachute was introduced. And rejected. The parachute question is not as simple as it looks. Western air forces by this point had long since accepted the parachute as a standard piece of aircrew equipment. The Germans had used parachutes as early as World War I. The British Royal Air Force issued them to all aircrew. The United States Army Air Corps considered them essential survival equipment, and their pilots were drilled in bailout procedures. The logic was entirely practical. A trained pilot is an enormously expensive investment. It takes years and thousands of hours to train a combat-ready aviator. Losing a plane is a setback. Losing the pilot is a catastrophe. So keep the pilot alive. Let him survive, recover, fly again. Japan's air commanders looked at that logic and, in the early years, largely rejected it. Not unanimously, not without internal debate. But the dominant culture of the Japanese military aviation community, especially in the Navy, treated the parachute with something approaching contempt. Carrying a parachute was, in the eyes of many Japanese aviators and their commanders, a declaration of intent to survive. And for a man who had been trained from the beginning to view his death in combat as honorable, even desirable, that declaration was shameful. There are accounts, recorded by Japanese veterans who survived the war and spoke to historians afterward, of pilots actively choosing not to carry their parachutes even when they were available, of pilots who threw them out of the cockpit before takeoff, of men who laughed at the idea that they might one day use one. This wasn't universal. There were pragmatic voices within Japanese aviation, particularly among some senior technical officers, who argued that keeping pilots alive made strategic sense. But those voices operated against a cultural current that was extraordinarily powerful and almost impossible to swim against in the atmosphere of 1930s and early 1940s Imperial Japan. You have to understand what Japan was in 1941. This was a nation that had been at war, in various forms, since 1931. That had invaded Manchuria, fought a brutal campaign in China, and developed an enormous military-industrial apparatus oriented entirely around expansion and conquest. The media was controlled. Dissent was crushed. Nationalism had reached a pitch that was almost religious in its intensity. And at the center of all of it was the figure of the emperor, Hirohito, who was not simply a political leader, but a divine being, a god in human form, whose will was the organizing principle of the entire society. To die in service of the emperor was not a sacrifice, it was an elevation. It was the highest possible expression of what a Japanese man could be. And for a fighter pilot, the cockpit was not just a workspace, it was a temple. And a man who jumped from that temple with a parachute, who floated down to the earth and was captured by the enemy, or even who simply survived when he might have died, had failed his divine purpose. This is the cultural bedrock underneath the parachute question. It wasn't a logistics problem, it wasn't a manufacturing problem, though those factors eventually came into play. It was a spiritual and ideological rejection of the concept of survival over death. Now let's get specific, because the culture is only part of the story. The tactical reality of the early Pacific War created its own very specific reasons why parachutes were not carried, even setting aside the ideology. The Zero fighter, the Mitsubishi A6M, was the most famous aircraft in the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service, and it was also, in its original design philosophy, a perfect encapsulation of everything that made Japanese military aviation both extraordinary and fatally flawed. The Zero was designed to achieve the impossible. Its range, its maneuverability, and its climb rate were all intended to exceed anything the Americans or British could put in the air. And in 1941 and early 1942, they did. The Zero genuinely was the most formidable carrier-based fighter in the world at the outbreak of the Pacific War. American and British pilots who first encountered it were shocked by what it could do. But to achieve those performance numbers, the designers of the Zero, led by Jiro Horikoshi, had to make trade-offs. Savage, unforgiving trade-offs. Everything that added weight was a candidate for removal. The fuel system had no self-sealing tanks, the airframe had no armor plating behind the pilot, the structural margins were extremely thin. The Zero was a masterpiece of aeronautical engineering, built to kill quickly, and it would die just as quickly if it was hit in the right place. Now consider where a parachute goes on a fighter aircraft. It goes under the pilot, as a seat pack, or behind him, as a backpack. Either way, it adds weight. It changes the center of gravity. It requires fittings and mounting hardware. In a design philosophy already so stripped down that the plane had no armor and no self-sealing tanks, adding a parachute was, in the minds of many Japanese aircraft designers and their military clients, a concession to the idea that the pilot might need to escape. And that idea, as we've established, was culturally contaminated. There's also a practical tactical issue that rarely gets discussed. The Zero's cockpit was not large. It was a tight, purpose-built workspace, optimized for a Japanese pilot of average build. Adding a parachute pack, especially a bulkier American-style chest or backpack type, created genuine ergonomic problems. Controls could be impeded. Range of motion could be restricted. In a plane that depended on its pilot being able to feel every nuance of its flight through the stick, even small impediments to movement mattered enormously. These weren't insurmountable problems. The Americans solved them. The British solved them. But solving them required a design commitment to crew survival that Japanese aviation, in its early wartime phase, simply did not prioritize. The Zero was not unique in this regard. The Nakajima Ki-43, the primary Army fighter, was built to similarly extreme weight optimization parameters. The Kawasaki Ki-61, the Nakajima Ki-44, the later models of the Zero, all of these aircraft were developed in a context where the pilot's survival was not considered a primary design constraint. And that context came directly from the top of the Japanese military hierarchy, filtered down through every level of aviation doctrine, training, and culture. Let's talk about what actually happened in those early months of the war. because the cultural and technical factors we've been discussing created real, observable battlefield consequences. And those consequences were felt not immediately, not in the first flush of Japanese military triumph, but in a way that would only become apparent months and years later. In December 1941, when the Japanese Carrier Strike Force launched its attack on Pearl Harbor, the air crews flying those missions were the finest combat aviators in the world. Men like Mitsuo Fuchida, who led the attack, or Saburo Sakai, who was already building a combat reputation in China that would eventually make him Japan's top surviving ace of the war. These men were products of the most demanding aviation training program anywhere on Earth. They had hundreds, in some cases over 1,000, hours of flight time. They had combat experience from China. They were the best. And Japan did not have very many of them. This is the fundamental paradox that the parachute question crystallizes with devastating clarity. Japan had built a small, elite force of extraordinary aviators and then built a culture, a doctrine, and equipment around those aviators that treated their deaths as desirable outcomes. The contradiction was catastrophic, because the thing about an elite is that once you lose it, you cannot replace it quickly. Japan could build more Zeros. It couldn't build more Saburo Sakais. The attrition question was something American and British planners understood at a deep strategic level, and Japanese commanders, for all their tactical brilliance, often failed to internalize. When an American pilot bailed out of a burning P-40 over the Pacific, the system kicked in. Search and rescue operations, established rescue networks, the whole infrastructure of keeping pilots alive and returning them to combat. American pilots were rescued from the water, from islands, from jungles. They went back to training establishments to teach their hard-won combat experience to the next generation. They wrote reports that were analyzed and disseminated. The knowledge loop stayed intact. When a Japanese pilot died in his cockpit, or died because he had no parachute to bail out with when his Zero caught fire, that was it. The years of training, the combat experience, the accumulated tactical knowledge, all of it went down with the aircraft. The loop was broken, and Japan was cutting its own loop, deliberately, ideologically, because dying in battle was honorable and surviving was not. The Battle of Midway in June 1942, just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, makes this vivid in a way that no abstract argument can. At Midway, Japan lost over 100 carrier aircraft and, critically, a large portion of its most experienced naval aviators. The number varies depending on the source and the calculation method, but the core fact is inescapable. Japan lost men at Midway who could not be replaced, not in months, possibly not in years. The training pipeline that had produced the Pearl Harbor Strike Force took years to run from entry to combat-ready aviator. You couldn't accelerate it without sacrificing quality, and Japan was about to start sacrificing quality in ways that would prove fatal. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, because Midway, important as it is not the only story here. The Guadalcanal campaign, which began in August 1942 and ground on until February 1943, is in some ways even more telling about the parachute question and its consequences. Guadalcanal was a grinding, attritional air campaign the likes of which Japan had never anticipated fighting. The Japanese had expected quick, decisive victories, the kind of lightning strikes that had worked so brilliantly at Pearl Harbor and in the Philippines and Malaya. Guadalcanal was the opposite. It was a sustained battle of attrition over a disease-ridden island in the Solomons, where both sides poured in air power and both sides bled. But they bled differently. American pilots who were shot down over Guadalcanal, or who ditched in Iron Bottom Sound, had a reasonable chance of being recovered. The Navy and Marines invested heavily in rescue. PBY Catalinas flew dangerous retrieval missions. PT boats picked men out of the water. The system wasn't perfect, but it functioned. American pilots came back. They flew again. Japanese pilots who were shot down over Guadalcanal, especially those flying long-range escort missions from Rabaul, were frequently beyond any realistic rescue range. The distances involved were punishing. A Zero flying from Rabaul to Guadalcanal and back was operating at the absolute outer edge of its range, with almost no fuel margin for error. A pilot who had to bail out, even one who survived the bailout, was almost certainly going to die of exposure, starvation, or drowning in the Coral Sea. The infrastructure to rescue him simply didn't exist, and even when distances were shorter, the cultural resistance to establishing rescue systems meant Japan was slow to develop them. There's a specific element of the Guadalcanal air campaign that illustrates this with painful precision. Japanese commanders at Rabaul were sending their best remaining carrier aviators, The men who had survived Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, Midway, on these long overwater missions to Guadalcanal, and they were losing them. Not because the pilots were bad, they were extraordinary, but because the missions required flying at the edge of fuel capacity, engaging in prolonged combat, and then flying back. Any damage to the aircraft, any wound to the pilot, any navigational error, and the man was lost. And unlike the Americans, Japan had no deep reserve of replacement pilots waiting to step in. The pipeline was already strained. The Guadalcanal campaign drained it to a critical point from which Japan never fully recovered. Saburo Sakai, Japan's greatest ace who survived the war, gives us a first-hand window into some of this. In August 1942, over Guadalcanal, Sakai was hit in the head by fire from a TBF Avenger he had mistaken for a fighter. He was partially blinded, grievously wounded, losing blood at a rate that should have killed him, and he flew his Zero for 4 hours back to Rabaul. 4 hours. Half-blind, fading in and out of consciousness, navigating by instinct and iron will across the open ocean. He made it. He survived. That story is told as a triumph, and it is. Sakai's will to live and his extraordinary skill are genuinely impressive, but read it again with the parachute question in mind. A grievously wounded man flew 4 hours rather than bail out. Why? Partly because he was over water, and bailout would likely mean death anyway. But partly, and Sakai himself acknowledged this in his memoirs, because the culture around him had trained him to stay with the aircraft, to die fighting if dying was what the mission required. The parachute wasn't in the equation, not physically, not mentally. Now let's go deeper into the actual mechanics of what happened to the parachute supply within the Japanese military system. Because the ideological resistance is one part of the story. The logistical reality is another. Japan in 1941 had a parachute supply that was frankly limited. The manufacturing capacity for parachute silk was not unlimited. The production of quality parachutes, packs, harnesses, and the associated hardware required a supply chain that was competing with every other demand of a nation at war. And in the prioritization hierarchy of Japanese military procurement, aircrew survival equipment ranked low, very low. The Army Air Force and the Navy Air Service both had parachutes available, but they were not issued as standard equipment in the way American or British parachutes were. In some units, parachutes were stored in hangars and could be drawn by pilots who wanted them. In others, they were not available at unit level at all. There was no standardized policy, no firm doctrine that said every pilot flies with a parachute on every mission. The decision was often left to the unit commander, sometimes to the individual pilot. And in the cultural atmosphere we've been describing, most commanders didn't push parachutes, and most pilots didn't ask for them. There were exceptions. Some Japanese pilots absolutely did carry parachutes and did use them successfully. There are documented cases of Japanese aviators bailing out over land, over friendly territory, and surviving. Some Army Air Force units, particularly those operating over China and Manchuria, where bailout over land was a realistic survival option, had somewhat better parachute cultures than Navy units operating over the Pacific. But these were exceptions against a dominant cultural norm that was deeply hostile to the whole concept. The training dimension deserves its own examination. Learning to use a parachute isn't something you can do instinctively. It requires training. You have to know how to buckle and check the harness correctly. You have to know how to exit the aircraft safely without getting struck by the tail. You have to know how to deploy the chute at the right altitude. You have to know how to control the descent, prepare for landing, release the harness on the ground. For carrier operations over water, you add additional layers of complexity. Water landings, raft deployment, emergency signaling. All of this takes training time. And training time in Japan's already brutally compressed aviation program was not allocated to survival training the way it was in American or British programs. The implicit message was clear. This is not what we are training you for. Compare this to American pilot training in the same period. American aviators were put through dedicated survival training. Parachute jumps were practiced. Water survival and ditching procedures were drilled repeatedly. The institutional message to American pilots was explicit. We want you to come back. We have built systems to bring you back. Learn them and use them. That institutional message, that cultural assumption that the pilot's life was worth preserving, had strategic consequences that went far beyond any individual bailout. Let's talk about the Zero's specific design compromises again, because the technical story is genuinely fascinating, and it connects directly to the parachute problem in ways that are not always spelled out clearly. Horikoshi's design team, working to meet a naval specification that was considered by many Western engineers to be impossible, achieved the Zero's performance numbers through a philosophy of absolute weight minimization. Every gram mattered. The airframe used an aluminum alloy called Extra Super Duralumin, developed by Sumitomo Metal Industries, which was stronger and lighter than the alloys used in most contemporary aircraft. The rivets were countersunk to reduce drag. The fuel tanks were made as thin as possible. The wings were made thin and flexible, which gave the Zero its legendary maneuverability at low and medium speeds. But the weight savings that gave the Zero its extraordinary range and maneuverability also meant that the aircraft was, in the blunt language of American test pilots who evaluated a captured Zero in 1942, extremely vulnerable to damage. It burned easily. A burst of .50 caliber rounds into the fuel tanks, which had no self-sealing liners, could turn a Zero into a fireball within seconds. There was no armor plate behind the pilot to protect him from attacks from the rear, and there was no heavy structural framing designed to keep the cockpit intact in a crash. The Zero was, to use a phrase that became common among American aviators, a death trap if it got hit. Now consider the implications for a pilot flying this aircraft in the absence of a parachute. His aircraft catches fire. He has seconds, perhaps less, before the fuel tanks or the ammunition explodes. Without a parachute, his options are to stay with the aircraft and die, or to put it into the ocean or the ground and hope to survive the crash, which in a Zero, given its construction, was rarely survivable. With a parachute, he has a third option: exit the cockpit, pull the ripcord, and live. The Japanese military had built an aircraft so dangerous that parachutes were practically essential, and then created a culture so hostile to parachutes that most pilots didn't carry them. The mismatch is almost unbearable to contemplate, and it was not an accident. It was the logical outcome of a military philosophy that had never resolved its fundamental contradiction between building precision instruments of war, as Japanese pilots undeniably were, and treating those instruments as expendable. The American response to the Zero threat in 1942 is instructive here. Once American commanders understood what they were dealing with, they issued new tactical guidance. Don't turn fight the Zero. Use diving attacks. Hit and run. Use the P-40's superior speed in a dive, and the Wildcat's ability to take more punishment. Don't get into a prolonged turning engagement, because you will lose. American tactics adapted to the Zero's strengths and exploited its weaknesses, and crucially, American commanders understood that adapting those tactics required keeping pilots alive long enough to learn and implement them. Dead pilots couldn't adapt. Prisoners of war couldn't adapt. But surviving pilots who had faced the Zero and figured out how to beat it, those men were invaluable. The famous Thach weave, developed by naval aviator John Thach, was born from exactly this kind of thinking. Thach had never engaged a Zero when he worked out the tactics. He used models and careful analysis of combat reports from pilots who had. Those reports existed because pilots had survived and come home and written them. The knowledge loop, fed by surviving pilots, produced one of the most effective fighter tactics of the entire Pacific War. Japan had no equivalent process, partly because its tactical culture was more rigid and less open to lessons learned feedback loops, but partly because the pilots who could have provided that feedback weren't coming home. Let's discuss something that often gets conflated with the early parachute question, but which is actually a distinct and later development. The kamikaze program, formalized in late 1944, is often seen as the ultimate expression of Japanese pilot culture, the logical endpoint of a military philosophy that had always viewed the pilot's death as acceptable. And in one sense, that's correct. The cultural soil that produced the refusal to carry parachutes in 1941 was the same soil that produced the deliberate suicide missions of 1944 and 1945. But there's an important distinction. The kamikaze program was, at least in its formal structure, a response to a specific strategic crisis. By late 1944, Japan had essentially run out of the kind of skilled pilots who could fight conventional air battles effectively. American air power, by this point, was overwhelming. The Hellcat, the Corsair, the P-38 were all decisively superior to anything Japan could produce in large quantities. American pilots were better trained, better equipped, and were supported by an industrial and logistical machine of staggering scale. Conventional Japanese aerial attack was producing almost no results at catastrophic cost. The kamikaze was, in a brutal and cynical sense, a tactical innovation designed to get maximum destructive effect out of pilots who were no longer skilled enough to fight effectively in conventional terms. A young pilot with 100 hours of training and average ability, who might be shot down on his first conventional attack mission could, if loaded into a bomb-equipped aircraft and pointed at an American warship, do significant damage before being destroyed. The kamikaze turned a weakness, the collapse of Japanese pilot quality, into a weapon by removing the requirement for the pilot to survive the mission. There's a dark arithmetic in this that military historians have explored extensively. Japan had started the war with a small number of extraordinary pilots and a culture that didn't preserve them. It ended the war with a large number of poorly trained pilots and a doctrine that formalized their expendability. The line from the refusal to carry parachutes in 1941 to the Kamikaze Corps of 1944 is not a straight line, but it runs in the same direction. It is the line of a military culture that had never decided, at its deepest level, that its own people were worth saving. But here's where the story gets genuinely complex, because not every Japanese pilot accepted this framework. Not every aviator went willingly to his death. The mythology of the uniformly death-embracing Japanese pilot is a post-war simplification that does real violence to the historical record. Many Japanese pilots were frightened. Many wanted to live. Many thought the culture of death was wasteful and strategically idiotic. They just couldn't say so out loud in the political atmosphere of wartime Japan without risking accusations of cowardice or disloyalty that could destroy their lives and dishonor their families. Saburo Sakai, again, is a useful reference point. Sakai was Japan's highest-scoring ace who survived the war, with 64 aerial victories. He was deeply committed to Japan and to the war effort, but in his post-war memoir, translated and published in the West as Samurai, he was remarkably candid about elements of Japanese military culture that he viewed as wasteful and self-destructive. He criticized commanders who threw away pilots' lives for no tactical gain. He acknowledged the mathematical reality that Japan could not sustain the kind of attrition it was suffering in its pilot corps. He was not a man who had unquestioningly embraced the concept of dying as a goal. He wanted to win, and he understood, perhaps better than most, that winning required staying alive. Other Japanese aviators who survived and later spoke to historians expressed similar views. The culture of death was real, and it was powerful, but it was not as total or as unanimous as the mythology suggests. There were pragmatists within the Japanese aviation community who saw the parachute as a tool rather than a shame. They just operated in an institution that was, for most of the war, structurally and culturally incapable of listening to them. The comparison with Germany is illuminating here. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, had its own culture of elitism and in some cases extreme aggression. German aces like Erich Hartmann, who scored over 350 aerial victories, were products of a system that placed enormous value on individual pilot excellence. But the Luftwaffe, for all its faults, did not have the same cultural hostility to pilot survival. German pilots were expected to use their parachutes. They were expected to survive if they could. Even in the most fanatical phases of the Nazi regime, the Luftwaffe's operational culture retained a basically pragmatic view of pilot survival as a military asset. The result was that pilots like Hartmann, who was shot down multiple times, survived their shoot-downs and kept flying. The accumulated experience of surviving German pilots, even as German air power collapsed in 1944 and 1945, meant that the Luftwaffe maintained a corps of extraordinarily experienced pilots until almost the final days of the war. They were outnumbered and outproduced, but they were not outexperienced. Japan, by contrast, had by 1944 and 1945 effectively lost its entire generation of experienced pilots, and the replacement generation was being fed into a tactical situation they were nowhere near equipped to handle. Now let's examine the specific moment when the parachute question started to shift. Because it did shift, though too late and too incompletely to make a strategic difference. By mid-1942, after Midway, some voices within Japanese aviation began arguing more loudly for a change in the approach to pilot survival. The evidence of catastrophic pilot losses was undeniable. The replacement pipeline was visibly inadequate. A small number of senior officers, particularly within the Navy Air Services training establishment, pushed for accelerated training programs, better rescue infrastructure, and yes, a more systematic approach to equipping pilots with parachutes and training them to use them. Some changes were made. The production of parachute equipment was modestly increased. Some training establishments began incorporating basic parachute instruction. In certain operational theaters, particularly where bailout over land was feasible, parachute usage became more common. The training pipeline was accelerated, though the acceleration itself created new problems because shorter training produced less capable pilots who were more likely to be shot down in the first place. But the fundamental cultural problem was never solved. An institution that has built its entire ethos around the concept of honorable death in battle cannot simply decide, mid-war, to start valuing survival. The cultural infrastructure is too deep, too pervasive, too embedded in every level of the institution, from recruit to admiral. You can issue more parachutes. You cannot issue a new set of values to a military culture that has been building its current ones for generations. The American pilots flying over the Pacific in 1943 and 1944 were facing Japanese opponents who were increasingly young, increasingly inexperienced, and increasingly desperate. The American pilots knew it. They could feel the quality difference in the dogfights. The tight, disciplined formations of 1942, the brilliant aerial attacks, the precise gunnery of the veteran Japanese airmen were being replaced by something rawer, more erratic, and more dangerous in a different way. Not dangerous because of skill, but dangerous because of unpredictability. A rookie pilot who has been told his death is the point is not the same tactical problem as a veteran pilot who is trying to stay alive and fight effectively. The rookie might do something a veteran wouldn't, fly directly into your guns, not because he's lost his mind, but because he has been trained to believe that the way he flies into those guns matters more than whether he survives the encounter. American pilots had to recalibrate their threat assessment mid-war as the nature of Japanese aerial opposition changed from elite professionals to ideologically motivated novices. The Marianas Turkey Shoot in June 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, makes this point with devastating clarity. In that engagement, American carrier air groups destroyed approximately 300 Japanese aircraft while losing fewer than 30 of their own. The Japanese pilots flying those missions were not cowards. They were not, most of them, lacking in courage, but they were outmatched in skill, in equipment, in tactical doctrine, and in the fundamental infrastructure of survival. They had not been trained as the Pearl Harbor Airmen had been trained. They had not accumulated the experience. And many of them were flying into combat without the equipment or the training that would have allowed them to survive being shot down and fight again. The Marianas Turkey Shoot was not primarily a victory of hardware over hardware, though American aircraft were certainly better by 1944. It was a victory of a survival-oriented military philosophy over a death-oriented one. The Americans had kept their pilots alive, trained them deeply, equipped them thoroughly, and built rescue systems to bring them back if they went down. Japan had done the opposite, and in June 1944 the bill came due. Let's step back from the tactical and operational level for a moment and think about what the parachute question tells us philosophically about the nature of the Pacific War and of total war in general. There is a tendency, in retrospective accounts of Japanese military culture, to romanticize the death embrace. The samurai code, Bushido, the willingness to die for the emperor, these things are often presented as something noble, something that speaks to the depth of Japanese cultural commitment and the extraordinary bravery of individual Japanese servicemen. And there is no doubt that many Japanese servicemen were brave, extraordinarily so. The men who flew from Rabaul to Guadalcanal and back, day after day, on missions that they knew might kill them, were brave. The pilots of the Pearl Harbor Strike Force were brave. Saburo Sakai was brave. No one who actually engages with the history should question that. But bravery without survival is a tactical liability. And a military culture that has systematized the destruction of its own most valuable human resources, that has built institutional hostility to the very concept of keeping its best-trained soldiers alive, is a culture that is fighting against itself as surely as it is fighting against the enemy. Japan's death culture, whatever its spiritual or ideological meaning within Japanese society, was a strategic catastrophe in the specific context of industrial-scale total war in the 20th century. A war in which the side that could most efficiently convert industrial output into military capability and maintain that military capability through trained personnel was almost certainly going to win. The United States was never going to lose that competition. Not because American soldiers and pilots were inherently braver or better than their Japanese counterparts. They were not. But because the United States had built military institutions that understood, at their core, that their people were the key variable. Machines could be built in factories in weeks. The men who flew them took years to train and were irreplaceable once lost. Every institutional decision, from parachute requirements to rescue systems to training depth to tactical doctrine, flowed from that understanding. Japan's institutions, whatever their other virtues, did not share that understanding. Or rather, they had a different understanding, one rooted in a cultural framework that valued the quality of death over the value of survival. And in the specific context of industrial total war, that framework was a path to strategic defeat. There is one more dimension of this story that deserves examination before we draw it together: the question of what Japan's pilots themselves actually believed, as opposed to what their institutions commanded them to believe. The evidence here is fragmentary, by definition, because the men who might have spoken most clearly about this are mostly dead. But the accounts that do exist, the memoirs, the post-war interviews, the letters that survived, paint a more complicated picture than the institutional mythology suggests. Some Japanese pilots genuinely believed in the death ideology. For them, it was not an imposition, but an expression of values they had internalized completely and authentically. These men flew without parachutes because they didn't want parachutes. They wanted to die well, in battle, in service of the emperor, and the idea of bailing out and surviving a shoot-down would have struck them as a failure, not a success. But others were more conflicted. There are accounts of pilots who carried parachutes secretly, in defiance of unit culture, because they simply wanted to live. There are accounts of pilots who confessed, sometimes in whispered conversations, sometimes in coded language in letters home, that they were afraid, that they didn't want to die, that they thought the whole enterprise was heading for catastrophe. These men could not say these things openly. The social and institutional pressures were simply too powerful. But the thoughts existed, the fear existed, the desire to survive existed. It was suppressed, not eliminated. And then there is the most poignant category of all, the men who had no clear belief either way, who were simply young, following orders, embedded in an institutional culture so total and so all-encompassing that the question of whether to carry a parachute had simply never really presented itself as a choice. They flew without parachutes because everyone around them flew without parachutes, because no one at their unit made it available, because the culture they swam in was the only culture they had ever known. For these men, the parachute question was less a matter of ideology than of institutional default. The default was death. No one had told them survival was an option. This is perhaps the most disturbing part of the whole story. Not the men who chose death because they believed in it, but the men who died because no one had bothered to tell them they could live. The Pacific War ended in August 1945 with Japan's surrender following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan had lost the war for many reasons, most of them having to do with the overwhelming industrial and logistical superiority of the United States and its allies. But the specific story of the Japanese pilot, the parachute question, the attrition of the experienced aviator corps, the cultural framework that valued death over survival, this story is a lens through which the entire trajectory of the air war becomes comprehensible in a way it otherwise isn't. Japan went into the Pacific War with the finest carrier aviation force in the world and a cultural framework that was slowly but surely destroying it. By mid-1942, the framework had inflicted wounds that would never fully heal. By 1944, those wounds had become fatal. By 1945, Japan's air defense of the home islands was being conducted by men in aircraft that were significantly inferior to what they were facing, with training so compressed as to be almost nominal, and with a tactical doctrine that had largely abandoned the pretense of conventional combat in favor of suicide missions that were, at their core, an admission that the Japanese aviation system had finally consumed itself. The men who flew those final missions deserve to be remembered, not as fanatics or as symbols of alien irrationality, but as human beings who were the products of an institution and a culture that had made choices, specific, identifiable, analyzable choices that led to this outcome. Choices about training, choices about equipment, choices about what to prioritize and what to discard, choices about whether survival was a value worth building an aviation culture around. Those choices began long before the kamikazes, before Guadalcanal, before Midway, even before Pearl Harbor. In some sense, they began in the decision not to put a parachute in the cockpit, not because the parachute itself was the critical variable, but because the decision to leave it out encoded, in hardware and in practice, an entire philosophy of what a Japanese pilot was supposed to be. Not a professional to be preserved and returned to combat, not an investment in human capital to be protected, but a weapon, a single-use weapon, refined to extraordinary precision, designed to do maximum damage, and expected to be spent. That philosophy built one of the most fearsome air forces the world had ever seen, one that shocked and humbled its enemies in the opening months of the war. And then it devoured that air force, slowly at first and then all at once, as the mathematics of total war caught up with the mathematics of cultural ideology. And Japan, for all the courage and brilliance of its aviators, never found a way to reconcile those two mathematical realities before it was too late. The lesson is not simple. It is not a comfortable lesson about the superiority of one culture over another. It is a lesson about institutions, about the consequences of ideological rigidity in the face of tactical reality, about what happens when an organization builds its identity around the destruction of its own people. And it is a lesson that echoes far beyond the Pacific War, far beyond aviation, into every institution that has ever had to decide whether the human beings inside it are worth saving. The pilots of Imperial Japan were extraordinary men, the finest aviators of their generation in many respects. They deserved better than the institution that sent them into battle without the most basic equipment to bring them home. And the story of why that institution made that choice, what it believed, what it feared, what it was willing to sacrifice, and what it was not, that story is still worth understanding, 80 years later, because the questions it raises about how we build institutions, what we ask of the people inside them, and whether we believe those people are worth saving, those questions have never stopped being relevant. The sky over the Pacific in one